The lights hum with a cold precision inside the studio, casting reflections off the lacquered desk, where Mark Levin sits like a prosecutor preparing for a verdict he's already written. His voice enters first, measured, rehearsed, heavy with the authority of someone too accustomed to being unchallenged. He leans forward, eyes narrowing behind the glassy studio glow, and announces that tonight's guest is a lawmaker with curious ideas about the Constitution. Across the split screen, Jasmine Crockett remains motionless. The air seems to pulse around her stillness. Her hands rest lightly, her gaze steady, not defiant, but unflinching. The tension isn't loud, it's alive, humming beneath each word Levin hurls across the digital divide. Viewers can sense he expects a stumble, a crack, a concession he can magnify. But when his monologue finally pauses for breath, Crockett tilts her head slightly and smiles. The moment feels surgical, quiet, devastating. "I understand it well enough," she says softly, "to know when someone's misusing it." Levin blinks, the studio silent for a half-second too long. Something irreversible begins. If moments like this remind you why truth still matters, why calm intelligence must stand firm against manufactured outrage, be part of this movement. Subscribe, share, and let stories of integrity rise above the noise. Together we can amplify the voices that choose dignity over dominance. Before the lights, before the studio, before the viral clip that would echo across timelines and talk shows, Jasmine Crockett's story was already one of confrontation, just not the kind that thrived on spectacle. She had built her career in the fluorescent corridors of Texas courtrooms, defending those without the luxury of being heard. As a public defender, she learned to stay calm in chaos, to find precision inside noise. Each case taught her that power rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as certainty, as confidence, as control. When she stepped into Congress, she carried that same courtroom discipline, the ability to dissect arrogance without matching its volume. Her presence, even in silence, became a quiet disruption to the performative rage that often filled committee rooms. Mark Levin, by contrast, was forged in an entirely different arena, one where provocation was the product. A longtime conservative commentator and constitutional polemicist, he honed his reputation through monologues that blended legal jargon with moral absolutism. For his audience, Levin was less a journalist and more a crusader against the cultural tide he saw as drowning American values. He didn't just argue, he performed certainty. The clipped cadence, the raised voice, the sense that every disagreement was a battle for civilization itself. All of it made him a mainstay on the right-wing airwaves. So when news broke that Crockett had agreed to appear on his show, even neutral observers sensed friction ahead. This wasn't a meeting of equals, it was a meeting of opposites. He represented a lineage of outrage. She, a lineage of endurance. He came armed with talking points meant to corner. She arrived with a calm meant to outlast. What neither fully anticipated was how clearly those instincts would collide on air. The lead-up to the exchange unfolded like a prelude to a courtroom drama. Levin's producers had teased the episode for days, promising an eye-opening conversation with a congresswoman who misunderstands the Constitution. The framing was deliberate, almost theatrical, a public cross-examination set to entertain an audience already primed to see Crockett fail. But Crockett had seen that tactic before. In hearings where her male colleagues talked over her, or when viral clips framed her passion as anger, she'd learned that the real test wasn't surviving the noise. It was commanding it without raising your voice. To many, her decision to go on Levin's show seemed reckless. Political allies warned it would be a trap. Critics predicted a spectacle. But Crockett's reasoning was simple. When you believe in your argument, you don't hide from opposition, you expose it. In her own words to aides before the taping, "If the truth can't hold its own, then it was never truth to begin with." That conviction would soon become the moral heartbeat of what unfolded. The ideological distance between them was vast, but the emotional distance was sharper. Levin's confidence came from control, his domain, his microphone, his audience. Crockett's confidence came from clarity, knowing that truth, when spoken plainly, doesn't need theatrics. The night of the broadcast, both carried those convictions like invisible armor. And so the stage was set. The veteran broadcaster, accustomed to dominance, and the congresswoman who understood that dominance isn't power, it's fear wearing certainty as disguise. What began as a conversation about the Constitution became something larger, almost allegorical, a test of temperaments, a contest between outrage and grace. By the time cameras rolled, even the studio air seemed to understand what was at stake. When the red recording light blinked on, Levin smiled like a man certain of his victory. He didn't yet realize he had just stepped into a duel he could not win, not because she would shout louder, but because she wouldn't need to. The broadcast begins like theater disguised as journalism. The opening music fades, the camera pans, and Mark Levin's voice cuts through the studio like a serrated edge. He wastes no time on pleasantries. "Congresswoman Crockett," he begins, with that practiced tone of disbelief that doubles as accusation. "You've said some curious things about the Constitution. Would you care to explain how your interpretation differs from, well, reality?" It isn't a question, it's a trap, polished and baited. The control room lights glint off the studio glass as Crockett exhales quietly, her gaze fixed not on him, but somewhere past the lens, as though measuring the weight of patience itself. Levin thrives on rhythm, the pulsing tempo of outrage. He punctuates his sentences with laughter sharp enough to sting, his hand chopping through the air for emphasis. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," he says to the camera, "this is what happens when ideology replaces intellect." His monologue sprawls, circling through constitutional clauses and cherry-picked precedents. The audience, his audience, responds with the comfort of familiarity. They've seen this act before, this storm of certainty, and in its eye sits Crockett, unmoving. Her stillness is the first rebellion. It unsettles him. Every host expects pushback, a sparring partner to sharpen against. Instead, she gives him silence, professional, unbothered, unnervingly composed. When he interrupts his own speech to jab, "Do you even understand the text of Article 1? She doesn't flinch. She waits. The silence stretches just long enough to make the moment feel strange. Then she leans toward the microphone, her voice steady, low, deliberate. "I practiced law before Congress, Mr. Levin," she begins. The phrasing lands with surgical precision. "I know the Constitution because I fought for people it was written to protect." The studio air changes. You can hear it in the soft buzz of the equipment, the faint shuffle of someone behind the camera. Levin straightens, smiles, attempts to laugh it off, but his timing falters. The script he's written in his head suddenly feels out of sync. For the first time, the conversation doesn't orbit him. Crockett has shifted the center of gravity. He tries to reclaim it with volume. "Well, that's a lovely speech," he sneers. "But defending criminals doesn't make you a constitutional scholar." The insult hangs in the air, designed to provoke, to make her rise to his frequency. But she doesn't. Instead, she lets a brief smile trace across her face, one that isn't amusement but acknowledgement. "Defending rights, Mr. Levin," she replies, "isn't about who the person is. It's about who we claim to be." The line cuts through the static of the broadcast like clean glass through smoke. Somewhere in the control room, a producer mouths, "Wow." On social media, where the show is live-streamed, the chat begins to shift from laughter emojis to quiet dots, people typing, waiting. Levin senses the drift. His tone sharpens, the laughter forced now. "You progressives love to moralize, but let's be honest. You don't care about the Constitution unless it serves your cause." The camera catches the gleam of sweat near his temple, a rare imperfection in a man who thrives on control. Crockett tilts her head slightly, her hands still folded. "I care about it," she says, "because people died waiting for it to include them." The silence that follows isn't comfortable. It's charged, electric. Levin opens his mouth, then stops. Something about the weight of her phrasing, its lack of performance, throws him off balance. He glances toward the camera, searching for the next talking point, but it doesn't come. To the casual viewer, the shift seems subtle, a tempo change, a faint unease. But to anyone who's ever watched a debate where power meets patience, the change is seismic. Levin's voice, once commanding, now sounds defensive. Crockett's pauses have become punctuation marks of authority. Every interruption he attempts lands weaker, shorter, more desperate to regain rhythm. When he accuses her of turning the Constitution into a social experiment, she responds not with argument, but with reflection. Every generation, she says, has to decide whether the Constitution protects people or protects privilege. I know which side I'm on. The camera doesn't cut away this time. Her words fill the frame. Levin laughs again, but the sound doesn't carry. "Oh, come on," he scoffs. "That's sentimental nonsense." His hand gestures are wider now, sharper, almost frantic. Crockett's gaze doesn't waver. "Then maybe," she says softly, "sentiment is what keeps justice human." The producers feel it before he does. The rhythm collapse, the audience turning. The chat fills with mixed reactions. Defenders rallying, others quoting her lines verbatim. Levin presses harder, his sentences overlapping hers, voice rising. But she refuses the bait. She listens through his interruptions, nodding slightly, eyes calm. Each time he finishes, she answers not to him, but to the truth itself, like someone testifying to history, not an audience. By the halfway mark of the segment, something invisible has inverted. Levin's volume no longer commands, it compensates. Crockett's composure no longer defends, it dominates. Every camera cut between them amplifies the contrast, his flailing certainty against her steady precision. And then just as he begins another retort, something about radical activism, she speaks again, quiet but final. "Mr. Levin, you seem angry that I won't fit the role you wrote for me. But that's not my job. My job is to tell the truth, whether or not it flatters your show." He stops. The studio hum persists, but the sound feels hollow. His eyes flicker, not rage now, but recognition. Something irreversible has begun. The energy in the room has turned completely. And though the audience doesn't yet know it, the next words she'll say will end the performance and redefine who truly held the power all along. It begins with a rhythm familiar to anyone who has ever watched Mark Levin in his element. The tone sharpens, the sentences shorten, and the cadence becomes that of a courtroom cross-examiner convinced he's moments away from cornering his witness. He leans toward the camera, hands slicing the air as if his conviction could cut through logic itself. "Let's test your constitutional expertise, Congresswoman," he says, his grin tight. If states have the right to manage their own elections, why should Washington interfere with how they conduct them? Isn't that, tyranny? Crockett exhales quietly, not with irritation but control. "States' rights," she says evenly, "have always been the refuge for those who can't defend inequality in plain terms." Levin tilts his head, pretending surprise. "So now federal oversight equals freedom?" He shoots back. She doesn't take the bait. Instead, she leans forward, voice measured. Freedom doesn't exist where access is denied. When voting rights are suppressed in one state, democracy is weakened in all 50. He smirks, sensing a chance to pivot. Typical progressive spin, turn every state issue into a moral crisis. "The Constitution doesn't mention emotions, Congresswoman. It's about law, not feelings." "And yet," she replies softly, "every law you defend was written by people whose feelings shaped what they believed counted as humanity." The audience falls still. It's a quiet rebuke, but it lands like thunder beneath Levin's posturing. The pause is visible. He blinks once, the briefest crack in composure, before launching another barrage of hypotheticals. "So tell me," he presses, "if the federal government can override the states on voting, can it override them on education? On speech? On religion? You see where your logic leads?" Her answer comes like a steady current through static. "I see where yours already has," she says. "Every generation that feared equality made the same argument. States' rights, local control, individual liberty. And every time, history showed that power protecting itself is not liberty. It's cowardice." Levin shifts in his chair, his voice rising half a register. The smooth rhythm of the seasoned broadcaster begins to falter. He resorts to overtalking, doubling down on interruption as a defense mechanism. "You're repeating slogans," he says sharply. "The Constitution isn't about feelings or fairness. It's about structure." That structure, she answers, was built to evolve. You can't freeze it in the century that suits you. He laughs, too loudly, too long. Oh, that's rich. Evolve? The founders would disagree with your little revisionist fantasy. Crockett's expression doesn't change. The founders disagreed with each other, she replies, tone level. But even they knew stagnation was death to democracy. That's why they wrote amendments, because they knew perfection wasn't in the text, it was in the striving. Her words carry the calm weight of conviction, the kind that doesn't need applause. Levin's face hardens. He feels the shift, the ground beneath him no longer firm but fissured, and then something breaks. Perhaps out of frustration, perhaps reflex, he reaches for mockery, the oldest weapon of the cornered. You sound very passionate, Congresswoman, he says, drawing out the syllables with a smirk. Though I must say, the way you say democracy, it's almost poetic. Is that the Texan in you, or just the lawyerly drawl? The line is meant to sound playful, but the undertone is unmistakable. The audience hears it. The laughter track doesn't come. His attempt at humor curdles before it finishes leaving his mouth. The air thickens, even through the camera. The moment feels wrong. Crockett doesn't flinch. Her eyes lock on him unblinking. A beat passes. When she finally speaks, her voice carries neither anger nor restraint. It carries clarity, the kind that ends arguments. When men like you mock how I speak, she says, what you're really mocking is where I come from. But that's exactly what gives me the right to speak here. The silence that follows is absolute. It's not the scripted pause of television, it's the breathless stillness of reckoning. Even Levin, practiced in the art of deflection, cannot find his next line. The grin remains frozen on his face, but the eyes betray it, caught between embarrassment and disbelief. Across the internet, viewers lean closer to their screens, sensing the turning point. Hashtags begin forming in real time. Clips are time-stamped for replay. But in the studio, it's still that same charged quiet, Crockett's calm presence expanding to fill every inch of the space Levin once controlled. When he finally speaks, the voice is thinner. Oh, come on, Congresswoman, he says, forcing a chuckle. Don't play the victim card. She doesn't respond immediately. Her gaze remains steady, and when she answers, it isn't defensive, it's declarative. Victimhood, she says, is when you're denied a voice. I'm using mine. It's surgical, the kind of reply that doesn't just dismantle the attack, it exposes the weakness beneath it. Levin blinks, swallows, attempts recovery. You're very good at rhetoric, he mutters. I'll give you that. Rhetoric is what you use when you don't have facts, she says. I have both. The crew exchanges glances. Even those accustomed to Levin's dominance feel something shifting, an unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of power has changed. He tries once more to pivot back to the Constitution, to reframe the conversation around original intent, but every word now feels hollow. Crockett's response is cut through the fog with a kind of moral precision that doesn't need amplification. You quote the founders like scripture, she tells him. But scripture without empathy is tyranny. They argued about liberty in rooms that excluded most of the people who needed it. My job is to make sure those rooms finally open. Levin's jaw tightens. That's not how governance works, Congresswoman. You can't rewrite history to suit your politics. Her reply lands like a quiet thunderclap. We're not rewriting history, Mr. Levin. We're correcting who gets to tell it. The exchange stretches for several more minutes. But it's no longer a debate. It's an unraveling. Levin's volume rises, his phrasing turning circular, desperate to find footing. Crockett remains immovable, her calmness no longer just demeanor, but dominance. Every rhetorical weapon he throws bounces back sharper. Every attempt to trivialize her composure only magnifies it. By the time the producer's countdown nears its close, Levin's earlier certainty has evaporated. The energy that once belonged to him now radiates from her presence. She hasn't raised her voice once, but she has taken the entire frame. Then, as the segment draws toward its break, she delivers one final strike, not a soundbite, but a sentence meant to linger. You wanted to test me on the Constitution, she says quietly. You just reminded everyone why we still need to defend it, from arrogance dressed as authority. Levin stares, momentarily speechless. The grin he's known for collapses into something unreadable. For the first time in his own studio, he looks small. The red camera light blinks, waiting, as though unsure whether to cut or to bear witness. In that instant, the duel ends not with applause, but with silence, a silence more powerful than any monologue he's ever delivered. It's the kind of silence that doesn't end when the show cuts to commercial. It lingers, seeps, travels, through screens, through conversations, through the digital arteries of a nation always watching who dares to speak truth to noise. It happens almost imperceptibly at first, a subtle alteration in tone, a breath held longer than usual. Levin leans back, a man searching for footing in a room that no longer belongs to him. His hands, once cutting the air like weapons, now rest uncertainly on the desk. Crockett, on the other hand, leans forward, not to retaliate, not to boast, but to seal what's already been decided. Her voice cuts through the static of his unraveling. Calm, final. You came here to humiliate me. But the Constitution doesn't belong to you, and neither does the microphone. The sentence isn't loud, yet it resonates with the gravity of something irreversible. Levin freezes mid-reaction, a blink too late to recover. The studio sound dips just enough for the quiet to feel vast. It's the kind of silence that swallows ego whole. For the first time, Levin's legendary control slips. His mouth opens, reflex, habit, but no words follow. The air itself seems to wait for him to reclaim authority, but the words won't come. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer's hand hovers over the cut signal, unsure whether to save him or let the moment play. Crockett doesn't move. Her stillness is the power now, the kind of presence that exposes noise for what it is. Her eyes remain locked, not with hostility but with the certainty of someone who no longer needs to win because she already has. Across social media, the response is instantaneous. Live comments erupt beneath the stream. She flipped it. He's done. That's what accountability looks like. Silenced by truth. It's not just a viral reaction, it's collective recognition. Viewers aren't cheering for spectacle. They're witnessing balance restored. The archetype of the loud man with the final word crumbles before their eyes. Levin attempts a faint smile, one of those practiced gestures meant to reassert composure, but the veneer doesn't hold. Well, he finally mutters, clearing his throat. That's one way to look at it. The line lands with a dull thud, more self-preservation than argument. Crockett doesn't answer. She simply sits back, letting the silence do what rebuttals can't. The camera lingers on her for half a second longer than usual, as if even the operator senses where the power now lives. That pause, brief but seismic, marks the real climax. The show built on confrontation suddenly finds itself redefined. For years, Levin's studio has been a stage where anger masqueraded as strength. But tonight, the energy has inverted. His aggression, once magnetic, feels theatrical. Her composure, once underestimated, feels transcendent. The light above him seems harsher now, amplifying every twitch, every flicker of discomfort. Behind the glass, staff exchange muted glances, recognizing what their host cannot yet admit. The hierarchy has shifted. The guest has become the anchor. The anchor has become the audience. Levin clears his throat again, gesturing toward the monitor. Let's move on, he says, trying to recover tempo, but the rhythm is gone. His voice no longer commands, it pleads for normalcy. Crockett's calm expression tells a different story. She knows this segment will be replayed, dissected, and remembered not as an argument, but as a reckoning. Moments later, as the show cuts to commercial, the illusion of control collapses fully. The instant the red light fades, Levin's face tightens into quiet frustration. He shuffles his papers. The crew looks anywhere but at him. Crockett, meanwhile, sits unmoved, still, centered, her expression unaltered. It's a tableau of transformation. Arrogance deflated, integrity unshaken. The man who built a career dominating debates finds himself cornered by something far stronger than rhetoric, grace under fire. And though the segment will be replayed countless times, dissected frame by frame, the essence of it all remains simple, a reminder of what true authority looks like. Not the loudest voice, not the one with the spotlight, but the one who stays steady when the storm tries to swallow her. In that single exchange, power doesn't just shift, it reveals its true form. And for everyone watching, the lesson is unmistakable. In an age of noise, composure is revolution. The reverberation begins before the studio lights cool. A producer's phone buzzes, then another. Within seconds, the moment has already leapt from the controlled environment of broadcast to the untamable ecosystem of the internet. On YouTube, someone uploads a slowed-down version of the final exchange, framing Crockett's steady gaze in cinematic close-up. Another creator overlays her quote, "The Constitution doesn't belong to you, and neither does the microphone," against orchestral music. It trends before Levin's team even drafts their official statement. The irony is sharp. A show built on control has lost all of it. Inside Levin's production office, panic mixes with defensiveness. Assistants scroll through feeds, watching the ratio climb, likes drowning dislikes, comments spiraling beyond management. One editor, sweating under pressure, trims the replay for the channel's archive, cutting out the last 20 seconds, the silence, the line, the look. But it doesn't matter. The original is already everywhere, mirrored, stitched, downloaded. The internet remembers what networks would prefer to forget. Meanwhile, Crockett's phone glows nonstop. Mentions, messages, emails. Her communications director stares at the analytics in disbelief. Follower counts climbing by tens of thousands per hour. Engagement tripling with each repost. Someone says quietly, "Congresswoman, you're trending in 23 countries." Crockett only nods, eyes calm, as if the storm were expected. Late-night hosts waste no time. Within hours, clips air across networks, each presenter taking a turn praising the precision of her response. One calls it a constitutional shutdown in under 10 seconds. Another describes it as what happens when arrogance meets articulation. The comedic montages loop, Levin's frozen expression until it becomes emblematic. Less of one man's misstep, more of a cultural pattern exposed. Conservative commentators scramble to reframe. Some insist she was disrespectful. Others avoid the subject entirely. But even within their circles, the tone softens. Nobody can deny the control she displayed. A columnist for a right-leaning paper writes reluctantly, "You don't have to agree with her politics to recognize that was poise under fire." The image of Levin's halted grin spreads faster than any caption can contain. Meme accounts spin variations. When the Wi-Fi of your argument disconnects. Political pages remix the moment into symbolic art, his blurred outline fading as her words glow in bold text. It becomes visual shorthand for reversal, a modern David and Goliath compressed into 15 seconds. Behind closed doors, Levin fumes. Staff members exchange nervous glances as he insists on reclaiming the narrative. A follow-up broadcast is scheduled, framed as a clarification episode, but the public mood has shifted. The appetite isn't for explanation, it's for authenticity, and Crockett has already delivered it. Across the country, law students discuss the encounter in classrooms. Professors reference it in lectures on courtroom demeanor and rhetorical balance. "Notice how she never raised her voice," one says. That's advocacy without aggression. Clips enter digital textbooks and social media case studies on media training. Even communication experts dissect her body language, the tilt of the head, the controlled breathing, the subtle power of silence. In Texas, Crockett's hometown news runs the segment under the headline, "Our Congresswoman Stands Tall." Local radio callers beam with pride. She reminded him that real strength isn't volume, it's vision. Messages flood into her office from around the nation. A mother writes, "My daughter watched you and said, 'That's how I want to speak someday.'" A young defense attorney tweets, "I've faced that same tone from men in court. Watching you hold your ground gave me courage for tomorrow's trial." The sentiment repeats in countless variations. She didn't just win an argument. She modeled a form of public courage many had forgotten existed. Meanwhile, political analysts debate what the moment signifies. Some call it a turning point in media decorum, others a generational shift in rhetoric. But beneath the commentary, something more profound hums, a collective hunger for the kind of composure that feels revolutionary in an age addicted to outrage. Levin's next broadcast opens with a forced laugh. He pretends to brush off the controversy, calling it internet theater. Yet even as he speaks, live comments remind him, "She owned that mic." Crockett 1, Levin 0. His control of the room feels thinner now, his authority dented by a single conversation he can't edit out of memory. For Crockett, the aftermath isn't victory, it's validation. She doesn't gloat, she refocuses. When a journalist asks what she thought of the viral fame, she replies simply, "If it makes one person think before dismissing another's voice, it was worth it." In the days that follow, the clip takes on a second life, not just as entertainment, but as evidence of a shift in how people perceive strength. Comment sections fill with reflections. "I felt proud watching her stay calm." "That's leadership, not yelling." Even cynics concede that something in the tone of discourse changed that night. The confrontation fades from Levin's schedule, but not from memory. It lingers in digital archives, reaction compilations, and hearts of viewers who saw in Crockett's restraint a mirror of their own battles, to be heard without shouting, to stand firm without fury. By the week's end, what began as a talk show segment has transformed into a cultural moment, one that reminds audiences everywhere that dignity, when wielded with precision, can silence even the loudest rooms, and that sometimes the quietest line carries the longest echo. By the following week, the moment has matured from viral clip to cultural mirror. What began as a televised clash of egos now hums at the center of a national reckoning, one that stretches beyond the walls of Mark Levin's studio or the confines of partisan camps. It has become a referendum on tone, gender, and the very architecture of public dialogue in America. Commentators from every corner of the political spectrum rush to decode what happened. Was it composure versus chaos? Or something deeper, a long-suppressed recalibration of who gets to define authority in the modern age? Political panels replay the exchange frame by frame. One analyst points out how Crockett's posture, hands still, eyes unwavering, conveyed command without aggression. Another notes how Levin's escalating tone revealed a reliance on performance over persuasion. The contrast, they say, was less about ideology than evolution. In an era where debate often rewards volume, Crockett reminded the nation that clarity can still cut sharper than spectacle. Cable news segments linger on that now iconic silence following her final line. That pause, a media critic explains, wasn't absence, it was dominance. The quiet didn't read as submission, it radiated certainty. For women in politics, it was more than vindication, it was a blueprint. Editorials in major outlets describe Crockett's response as a moment of rhetorical integrity, a case study in reclaiming presence without sacrificing principle. Meanwhile, Levin's image begins to warp under scrutiny. The same bluster once hailed as conviction now feels like theater. Viewers revisit his catalog of interviews and notice a pattern, an impatience with dissent, a dependency on control. His detractors label it performative outrage. His defenders insist he was ambushed by optics. But even among his fans, there's quiet recognition. Something in that studio broke, and it wasn't the guest's composure. Across campuses, communication professors fold the encounter into lectures on gender dynamics and the politics of interruption. Students analyze the transcript like literature. They underline how Crockett's line about mockery, "What you're really mocking is where I come from," transforms personal insult into moral confrontation. It becomes a moment of cultural pedagogy, the marginalized refusing invisibility, the calm reclaiming command. Progressive media embraces the exchange as symbolic proof that empathy and intellect can coexist with strength. Podcasters celebrate it as the antithesis of cable news chaos. One host notes, "She didn't just answer him, she rewrote the rhythm of political discourse." Conservative commentators, wary of feeding the narrative, minimize coverage, yet can't fully ignore the resonance. Even among skeptics, her poise is reluctantly admired. Soon, the discussion expands from who won to what the moment revealed. Think pieces explore how women in public life navigate double standards, penalized for passion, dismissed for calm. Crockett's unflappable tone becomes the counterexample, the demonstration that leadership can be firm without fury. Social science writers coin phrases like the Crockett effect to describe the rising appetite for integrity over indignation. Organizations devoted to civic engagement seize the opportunity. Workshops on constructive discourse reference the clip as a teaching tool. Advocacy groups highlight it in campaigns promoting respect in politics. The American Bar Association releases a brief article praising her conduct as the courtroom ethic translated to public service. The ripple doesn't stop at academia or media. On TikTok, young creators mimic the exchange in short skits, one playing Levin's bluster, the other Crockett's calm, ending with her line as a punch-in of empowerment. On Twitter, women in corporate and legal professions post, "Channeling my inner Crockett today." A subtle cultural reprogramming begins. Restraint becomes aspirational again. For Levin, the consequences are quieter but persistent. Bookings decline slightly. A few sponsors distance themselves under the banner of brand re-evaluation. His core audience remains, but smaller, more defensive. When he addresses the controversy weeks later, calling it a media exaggeration, the tone rings hollow. The authenticity that once fueled his credibility now feels staged. His brand of certainty, once thunderous, echoes into a diminished space. In contrast, Crockett's stature grows. Invitations to speak on panels, law symposiums, and leadership conferences multiply. Yet her responses remain grounded. When asked about the viral fame, she tells one interviewer, "If that moment made people believe that composure still works, then good. But it shouldn't be rare." That humility, measured, authentic, cements her influence further. By now, the clip has evolved into a cultural shorthand. Commentators refer to similar public reckonings as another Crockett moment. It signals the shift from spectacle-driven discourse to substance-anchored courage. For a country fatigued by performative politics, the relief is almost spiritual. Viewers who had grown numb to shouting matches rediscover engagement through dignity. Beyond politics, the implications deepen. Schools use the exchange to discuss digital ethics, how truth travels faster when carried with grace. Diversity trainers cite it as proof that representation matters not as tokenism, but as tonal reformation. Because when someone like Crockett commands respect without demanding it, she reframes who gets to speak with authority in America. Weeks later, during a congressional hearing on media accountability, her name surfaces again. A colleague references her exchange with Levin, calling it a modern civics lesson broadcast live. Applause ripples through the chamber. The moment has transcended the show. It has entered the lexicon of civic memory. What remains after the dust settles isn't merely a viral win or partisan triumph. It's a recalibration of value. Crockett didn't just silence a host. She reminded millions that persuasion isn't noise, it's nuance. That power, real power, doesn't need to shout. It needs only to stand steady in the storm. In retrospect, that night was never simply about a talk show clash. It was about the quiet reconstruction of moral architecture in real time. What Jasmine Crockett displayed wasn't just eloquence under fire. It was ethical geometry, a deliberate alignment of patience, principle, and precision against the brute force of ego. Her calm was not passive. It was an act of disciplined defiance, one that inverted the hierarchy of noise our politics too often rewards. Through her restraint, Crockett revealed something vital. Arrogance has no argument once composure refuses to collapse. In the face of provocation, she embodied a truth that transcends partisanship, that conviction, when anchored in empathy, becomes unassailable. Every pause she held became a mirror, reflecting how easily fury exposes its own fragility. The spectacle designed to belittle her instead magnified her integrity. Her exchange with Levin now circulates through classrooms, newsrooms, and boardrooms as a case study in leadership under pressure. Journalism schools screen the clip during ethics modules on power and representation. Law professors use it to illustrate the art of remaining fact-centered when rhetoric turns personal. Communication coaches cite her posture, tone, and timing as a masterclass in authority without aggression. Each replay reaffirms the same lesson. Dignity is strategy, not softness. For young women watching, her performance offered a vocabulary for confidence that doesn't imitate dominance. For men learning from it, it quietly redefined what strength can look like: measured, unflinching, human. In every retelling, Crockett's restraint becomes a generational template, proof that one doesn't need to overpower to overcome. Even in hindsight, the power of that moment feels larger than the personalities involved. It represents a shift in the moral weather of public life. Levin's mockery vanished into digital noise, but her line, the one that defended both identity and principle, continues to echo because it spoke to something timeless: the right to exist in one's own voice without apology. Ultimately, the legacy of that confrontation lies not in its virality, but in its virtue. Crockett reminded a weary audience that leadership isn't about dominating a room, it's about dignifying it. She turned a spectacle meant to diminish her into a seminar on self-possession, proving that truth, carried with composure, outlasts every outburst. And so, history will remember not the shout that tried to silence her, but the silence that followed, the silence that spoke louder than rage, that recentered power in the space between words. In that quiet, a new definition of strength was born. Every generation faces a moment that redefines what strength truly means, and this was one of them. Jasmine Crockett's composure in the face of provocation wasn't about silencing her opponent. It was about restoring something sacred to public life: the belief that truth, when spoken with grace, still carries weight. Her calm turned confrontation into clarity, her restraint into resonance. In an age where shouting too often drowns out sincerity, her example stands as quiet proof that dignity endures. She reminded us that integrity isn't weakness, it's endurance, discipline, and faith in the power of reason. If you believe our democracy still depends on voices that choose truth over theater, stay connected. Share this story, subscribe, and help amplify the kind of courage that builds, not breaks. Because every time integrity rises, arrogance falls, and every viewer who listens helps justice speak a little louder.